In our first video on Samuel Clarke's version of the cosmological argument, we looked at the distinction between dependent beings and independent or self-existent beings. Remember, a dependent being is one whose existence is causally accounted for by the activity of other being or another being or beings, right? So I am a dependent being, and you are a dependent being, and everyone I know is a dependent being. An elephant is a dependent being. An independent or self-existent being is a being whose existence is accounted for by its own nature. Again, just because we're defining that doesn't mean that an independent or self-existent being exists. We're just defining it and showing how that is distinct from a dependent being. In the first part of the argument, all we've done is made this distinction, and we've set up the principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. Remember, the principle of sufficient reason is just this idea that there must be an explanation, A, of the existence of any being or thing, and B, of any positive fact. So, for any being or thing that exists, there must be an explanation. That is to say, a causal explanation of why it's there. So, let's say that there's a professor is found dead on campus, and there is a knife in his back, and they found him this way, and we decide that we are all great inductive and deductive minds, and so we're going to take on this case. And one of us proposes, well, maybe what happened is that the knife popped into existence and popped into the existence into the universe there. And this happened, unfortunately for the professor, that where it popped into existence just happened to be, where the professor was. And so sad for him. Well, no, nobody's going to buy that explanation, and for good reason. We all accept the principle of sufficient reason, that there must be an explanation for the existence of any being or thing. Causally, there's a reason why things come to exist, and there's an explanation for every positive fact. Again, we don't have to explain a negative fact, like why unicorns don't exist. We don't have to explain that. But why elephants do exist, yes, that's a positive fact, and we need an explanation for that. So the principle of sufficient reason means that there must be an explanation. That is a causal explanation for the existence of any being or thing and of any positive fact. That's what we've established so far. And that's part one of the argument. Part two is where we get the premises, and there are only two this time. Here are the premises. Part two. Premise one. Every being that exists or ever did exist is either a dependent being or an independent being. Premise two. Not every being can be a dependent being. Therefore, there exists an independent or self-existent being. So, let's look at premise one. Premise one is saying, look, we made a distinction between dependent beings and independent beings, and that's all there is. There are beings whose existence is accounted for by the causal activity of other beings and there's, or possibly there could be beings whose existence is accounted for by their own nature. Those are the only possibilities, right? Doesn't seem too hard there. That's all premise one is saying, is that those are the two possibilities. Premise two says not every being can be a dependent being. Why not? Well, let's think about why not. On the surface of things, it seems as though there's a regress problem. Let's take a group of elephants. I've got Dumbo here on the right. Let's start with Dumbo. Now, where did Dumbo come from? Dumbo is a dependent being. Where did Dumbo come from? Dumbo is accounted for by the causal activity of his parents. And he came specifically from his mother there, Jumbo. Where did Jumbo come from? Well, Jumbo came from her mother, Mumbo. And Mumbo came from her mother, Numbo. And Numbo came from Quumbo, who came from Rumbo, who came from Exumbo, who came from, I don't know, and run out of names. But that's fine. We can go back and 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 back. We can go back a long way, but can we go back forever? We can't go back forever. Why not? Well, let's look again at the principle of sufficient reason. Let's say, and this, by the way, is where I think the argument gets really interesting and really brilliant. Let's say that there is an infinite chain of dependent beings going back and back and back and back forever. Would each and every member of the chain have a causal explanation? That is, let's look at PSR A. Would there be an explanation for the existence of every being or thing in the chain? I think maybe there would be. Pick any elephant, I can tell you where it came from. It came from its mother. But let's move to PSRB. Let's ask, what is the explanation for the positive fact that elephants exist at all rather than not? If it's just an infinite chain of dependent beings going back and 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 back forever, then what's the explanation for the positive fact that the set of dependent beings should exist at all rather than not? Do you see the problem? Nothing should exist, but things do. There are dependent beings. What Samuel Clarke is saying is that since there are dependent beings, there must be an independent or self-existent being. Because not every being can be a dependent being. We can't have an infinite chain of dependent beings going back and back and back and back and back. We can go back and back and back for a long time, Dumbo came from Jumbo, came from Mumbo, came from Numbo. And you can go back and back and back. You can go back through evolution. We can go back to before they were elephants, to another species. We go back to single cell organisms. But where did those come from? Eventually, eventually, we need an explanation. Where did these dependent beings come from? We need an explanation for the positive fact that these dependent beings exist at all rather than not. And without an independent or self-existent being, we don't have an answer to that. We don't have an explanation for that positive fact. I'll see you again in the next video.